Welcome to the Loved Called Gifted podcast. This is your place to come for musings about spirituality, identity and purpose. I'm your host, Catherine Cowell. So I'm delighted for this episode to be joined again by Polly for another conversation about some of the principles around Myers Briggs that help us to understand one another. Today we're going to have a conversation about two concepts called sensing and intuition. There are three others in this series. We did an introduction and then Polly and I had a conversation about introversion and extroversion. And then I had a conversation with Sean about thinking and feeling and the differences between those two. So today we're going to have a conversation about sensing and intuition. And we sort of roughly divide into people who have a preference for sensing and people who have a preference for intuition. And the intuition in Myers Briggs terms, if you ever see a kind of a Myers Briggs personality descriptor that has an N next to it. Just to be clear, we're not Myers Briggs practitioners. We are people who have been working with and journeying with these ideas for a long time. And so we're simply giving our insights. So if you wanted to really get a good idea about your Myers Briggs personality type, then the thing to do would be to go and spend some time either with a really good book on the subject and or somebody who's a Myers Briggs practitioner who could help you to do that. So thank you ever so much for coming again, Polly. It's brilliant.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back again with you.
So do you have a bit of a definition for sensing and intuition?
I do. It's all around gathering information and taking in information. So for me, I am a sensing. I'd say I'm a very highly sensing person. And it means that my head is quite busy a lot of the time because I take in information through all my senses. So if you ask me to remember something or if I have a memory of something, I won't just be describing what happened. I will have stored away with that memory potentially smells that might have been significant, noise, any kind of noise, music, etc. If there was food involved, I would probably be able to remember whether I enjoyed it, how tasty it was. So if you think about our five senses as such, it means that I'm kind of collecting that sort of information through all my senses as I'm wandering through. So in a particular situation, when I'm thinking about things, I tend to be thinking on the basis of pulling in that kind of what I would call concrete information. Whereas on the intuition side, it means that when you sit and think about something, your information is probably more likely to come from stuff that you already know, and it comes from somewhere in your head. It doesn't mean that you pay no attention at all to what's going on around you, but it's kind of a more interior thinking and consideration.
Yeah.
That's kind of...
As an intuitive, as somebody with a preference for intuition, I want a theory and then I'm happy to kind of fill in the bits. Whereas my experience of people with a preference for sensing is that you're not going to understand the big theory because you're not particularly interested in that until you understand what the kind of concrete details are.
Yes.
So you want to build up a picture. Whereas I want a framework that gives me a lens through which I can then look at things. So as we're talking about it, Myers Briggs personality typing is one of those frameworks that I would use. So if I'm having a conversation with somebody and I notice that they are very expressive, that they are talking a lot, but I'm not really getting a word in edgeways, then my Myers Briggs kind of framework comes in. I think, I am speaking now with an extrovert.
Okay.
So I remember when I was working at the hospital, quite often the chief executive team would come up with a big theory about how we were going to move forwards as a hospital. And quite often those big theories would really annoy and rile my sensing friends. So, well, what on earth does that mean?
Yeah.
So at one point they got very enthused by the fact that Tesco's had a particular approach to managing things. And they talked about the whole sort of every little helps concept and felt that mapped really easily across to the hospital. And I thought, oh yeah, no, I can see how you could make, I can see where there might be comparisons with that. I can see how that works. Whereas my sensing colleagues were sort of saying, well, that's got nothing to do with healthcare. So unless somebody says, well, let's talk about how that might actually apply on a day-to-day basis in a hospital setting, where we might think about small things that we could improve that will make a big difference. Now, you could argue about whether that was a sensible theory to be coming across with, or whether it was relevant, or whether it was helpful or not. But I did get what they were aiming at.
I think what's kind of going off in my head in response to what you're saying is that I think that a sensing person in a mixed group where somebody is, if you like, vision casting, for want of a better word, somebody who is sensing can come across as being quite negative about progress. Because before we will sign up for something, it's like we want to nail down the details.
Yeah.
So at the end of a meeting, we wouldn't be happy to say yes or no to a particular set of suggestions without having worked through all the potential impacts into all of the systems that we kind of know. And the other thing I was thinking, what you were describing to a certain extent was about, I'm thinking about experiential learning.
Yeah.
So both sensing people and intuitive people will have a degree of experiential learning as well. And it's one of the things that I'm quite interested in is how Myers Briggs fits into people's preferences for particular ways of learning information.
Yeah, I think I'm now thinking about the experiential learning. I'm just remembering science lessons at school. And I think part of the issue with science lessons when we did practicals is that quite often I think probably the equipment was a bit naff or a bit dirty and it didn't quite work out as you wanted it to. But I was much, much more interested in what's the scientific theory. Really interested in working out what it is that we want to know from this experiment and what that tells us about the world. Far less interested in actually sitting and doing the experiment.
Okay.
That almost felt like a bit of a distraction because I've got it now. I understand it. I understand what we're doing. I understand about chlorophyll in leaves. I don't need to bleach a leaf to find out that it's got green stuff in it because you've just told me how the green stuff works.
So you're happy to accept there is this stuff called chlorophyll. You don't have a burning issue to kind of check that it is what they say it is. Respiration in plants. Yeah.
Yes, once I've got that, and I do want to know how you've come to that conclusion, but I don't have a need to sort of, on a sensory level, to experience it.
Okay.
Whereas I think a sensory approach would be, well, I'd like to see this in lots of circumstances. I'd like to see it working, and now I've got the proof, and now I get a picture of how the world works, sort of that way round.
Yeah. I think a lot of it. I mean, when it comes to a lot of my own education, I'm kind of working backwards. So I'm kind of having to think through experiences and stuff that I had based on what I now know, because I had been through all my education before I understood or came to an understanding of Myers Briggs. Something that has made it more interesting is because I'm now in a position where I'm teaching and I'm having to look at things like learning, how do people learn best, different ways of presenting information. So I use my own experiences a lot in that sense. And I guess that for me, the sciences, chemistry was always the one that came most easily to me because it was so demonstrative. It's like you put something with something else and something happens. And I wasn't too worried whether or not the thing that happened was the thing that the teacher had led us to expect was happening. But because there was something concrete that I could connect to and respond to, and I had seen something, I had smelt something, I had heard the bang or the fizz or the crackle or whatever. And what I do find is that with a more theoretical science, something like physics, for example, a lot of what I was taught in physics I didn't understand because it wasn't exemplified in something concrete. Yeah. So I know that sometimes I really struggle, and again with in some of the conversations we have with Tom and the things that we talk about, so we talk a lot about beliefs and, what could be called philosophy, worldviews, the way that people think about things. And sometimes the resources that he suggests I might read, I just don't get on with them at all because it's too theoretical.
Yeah.
So to me, somebody could explain some kind of thought process or some kind of theory about how the world works, and straight away I'd be like, that doesn't help. Or something, it doesn't help humanity to be better humans and stuff like this. So there is that thing about having something concrete. I need to be able to see how something is going to work in the real world. I have done visualizations. And I can very easily get lost, especially if a visualization is about something that has happened to me. But for example, I've done something where we had to draw a picture of the garden of the house that we lived in when we were 7.
Yeah.
And I could so easily have got lost in that because there were so many different aspects to it. And it was like, There's
a lot of concrete detail in that, isn't there?
Yes,
If you're looking at a garden, there's lots of concrete detail.
Yes.
So I know that if I am speaking to people who have a preference for sensing, it's no good just explaining my big theory. I need to say, so what this means practically for you on Tuesday morning is this.
This is what it will look like.
This is what it looks like. So if I'm listening to a talk or a lecture or a sermon at church, then I'm interested in the theory bit. When people start to say, so what this means you can do, and I'm like, perfectly happy to work out my own good ideas. Thank you very much. Yeah. And I quite like the process of working out my own good ideas from the basis of my having understood the theory. And I think one of the powers that intuition can give you is that actually you can quite quickly see the wood for the trees. So when I'm coaching somebody, what I'm looking for is, well, what's the pattern here? What's the big shapes? If you were drawing a picture, kind of what are the big colours? What are the things? What are the links? Where are the things that are kind of beginning to tie together to create a bit of a pattern? And quite often I will be able to spot those links and the person who's in the middle of it can't spot them. And you say, well, I think I've heard you say this several times, so I'm wondering if there's something going on. Oh, yes, you're right.
I think that's really interesting with that, though, is that I would do something similar, but possibly because I've observed so much over the years, because my thing is people and pastoral care and all of those sorts of things, and I think because I've made so many observations, that kind of pattern matching I do, but coming from the sensing perspective.
No, I think it's worth pointing out at this point that we've both been around a while.
Yes.
And so one of the things that happens is that as we get older, we grow into our opposite.
Yes.
So I am much, much more sensing than I used to be. So I'm much more likely to notice things and notice details and enjoy that than I used to be.
Yeah.
So I quite enjoy just sitting and looking at something in a way that I didn't. Some of the ways that I relax sometimes might be sit with a cup of tea and look. And a number of years ago, I don't think I would have done that in the same way.
Yeah. I'm understanding more and more why it is that geology was such a good fit for me, because I didn't, there's a whole load of stuff I didn't really understand about myself at the time and how I operate. But coming onto geology, and it is so observational, it is, you don't get much more concrete than a rock, really. So it kind of, and sometimes the rock is concrete because I've done a lot of work with concrete as well.
I was just thinking about the way that people with a preference for sensing and a preference for intuition can come across to one another as if they're missing the point, when actually they're not. So the first incident I'm thinking of, and I have a preference for intuition, and I was leading a staff meeting at the department that I was managing. And my question as a sort of visionary person was, so I'd really like us to discuss together what we could do to improve the department and make things better. There's a bit of silence, and then one of the members of staff said, that soap dispenser in the toilet is dripping. And I think it would be a very good idea if we sorted that out, because it is a trip hazard. And I'm thinking, you have completely missed my question.
Yeah.
Because I'm talking about what's going to improve the department. And then I twigged, because I had recently, it was not long after I'd first encountered Myers Briggs. I thought, no, you have understood the question. And do you think the department would be better if we sorted out the dripping soap dispenser?
Yeah.
And she wasn't wrong, but that didn't feel like the kind of the big stuff that I was expecting people to say, like, well, this part of our service we could expand, or we could make this bit smaller, or maybe we could have a project to do communication aids for this group of people. Or so I was thinking big picture, and she was thinking very small picture. And then I'm thinking of a conversation I had when I was doing some coaching consultancy stuff with a fairly big organisation. I'd done some coaching with one of the members of staff, and then was wanting to have a conversation with her boss. And he began the conversation by talking about what he perceived to be the changes in politics across Europe.
Okay.
And for him, that was relevant to the conversation that we were having. But I mean, that is big picture. So I can see this global trend, which inevitably means that things are going to be shifting in this way. So my member of staff, who's got a team of 4 people, needs to be thinking like this.
8 or 12 people.
Well, I don't think it was even that, but it was kind of, so her perspective needs to be influenced by this big move, that I can see this socio-political change coming over the horizon that we need to be prepared for. And both of those perspectives have merit, but you can imagine that my soap dispenser person was not going to understand my Europe-wide political movement person, and vice versa. And actually, I did a training day on communication with that particular organisation, and we talked about big chunk thinking and small chunk thinking. And I know that is it's only one element, I think, the sensing intuition type perspective, but they found that really, really helpful to know that some people are going to think in small chunks and some people are going to think in big chunks. And so you need to be able to translate for one another. So if you're a big chunk thinker, then you need to be aware that this thing is going to, at some point on Tuesday morning, somebody is going to need to do something. And if they don't understand what it is that they're going to need to do, then what you're saying isn't going to make any sense.
Not everybody who works with a product is going to understand that product the way that the designers have.
Yeah, so your passion for instructions and them being good is about how is this going to work on a day-to-day basis, practically.
And needing to understand, you know, that the person using something needs to know how to understand it. So certain things, if it's a practical thing, I guess that I've become aware that I need to see it being done, which comes back to the kind of the chemistry and science at school. Because in chemistry, we would be doing something with physical things. I could then understand the textbook explanation of what was going on because I've seen something. I guess with a lot of physics, you can't see it. So you can see the effect. It's like with the apple dropping from the tree, isn't it? You don't see the gravity. You see the impact of the gravity on something else. So it's kind of, it's a step away from seeing.
See, I like abstract things. I think my downfall is that I'm not that great with numbers. So thinking in numbers doesn't work for me. But in principle, I think I would really have enjoyed physics, because as an outsider, what I would observe is that there are a relatively small number of principles from which you can derive lots of stuff. And that's what I like. So I was very lucky that I went to a school that did Nuffield sciences. Yeah. And what was brilliant about that was that they would give you the principle, and then when you were in the exam, you would have lots of examples that you'd never come across before. And I loved that because I really liked that kind of, okay, so which overarching principle do I need to apply to this now? That for me was just great fun. I really liked that. Whereas when it got to sort of A-level chemistry, there was a lot to remember, lots of an organic chemistry. Oh, my life. And I definitely wouldn't have done biochemistry, because that's like the most convoluted bits of chemistry with the most convoluted, detailed bits of biology. And I wasn't into that.
But again, it's interesting that, because I'm like, for me, the whole thing with chemistry, and this is where there's an overlap with things like atomic structure. There's an overlap between physics and chemistry. But it's like, I could visualize what would happen because I understand the structure.
Yeah.
So a lot of the stuff with the particular, my specialty, which was not just geology and rocks, but engineering it. I always think that, in effect, what I am is a materials scientist.
Yeah.
So because I understand the layout of the material and where the atoms are and the structure of it and how it forms, that's how I know how it's going to behave in certain situations. So all of those situations, they can be described mathematically, which is kind of where the design and stuff like that comes in. But I think mine is much more, it's kind of like an understanding of the material, almost as if I'm inside the material. And it's interesting that, we seem to have found some examples that sort of work really well, I think, to show that different approach. If I just compare the way me and Tom, when we're driving up to a roundabout, I am preparing for the next manoeuvre a lot more further back down the road than Tom usually is. So he would be, oh, right, there's a roundabout coming up. And then at the roundabout, he then looks, as we're all trained to do. But I tend to be making that decision rather than being made at the point. I will have been making that decision and kind of preparing for it in much more in advance. So I would argue that my driving is probably a bit smoother, because I'm kind of responding the whole time I'm driving, not when something changes or when you've got a particular maneuver to do. I don't even know whether you're looking a bit puzzled at me. I'm thinking.
No, I think you're probably right that I'm not particularly listening to the sound that the car's making. I'm not noticing lots of things. I'm noticing the big things. So there is a roundabout. We are turning left soon. This is a 40-mile-an-hour zone, not necessarily all of the details. So in order to drive well, I need to employ some of my perhaps sometimes underused sensory skills sometimes. I remember hearing somebody say that people with a preference for sensing are much more likely to categorise things into smaller chunks. And she's a Myers Briggs practitioner. And one of her questions often is, do you separate your wardrobe into different colours?
Yes. I do.
I do not.
Yes.
And do you have, this is something that I would notice, and do you have different notebooks for different things?
Yes, I do. See,
I can't cope with different notebooks for different things, because I can always see how there are overlaps between the different things.
There are.
So
it's a challenge sometimes.
Yes. So I have, at various points in my life, had more than one notebook for different purposes, and always ended up with one notebook. In fact, at one point when I had a paper diary, almost all of my note-taking was in the diary.
So I have a separate paper diary, and I then have a separate notebook, which literally is just for reflective stuff.
If I see in the supermarket shelves, the kind of the A4 notebooks with all the different tabs.
Yeah.
I do not like those. They don't work for me because I don't know what to put in which section.
So this is interesting, because I don't like them either. But the reason why I don't like them is I see it as a limitation.
Right.
Which I think is probably quite interesting. But probably I can see where it might fit, because the way I'm very, very organised. And the way that I keep everything organised is by colour. So, for example, at work, because I teach on different modules and different subjects that I teach, I've got about 5 categories for different aspects of my work that I do. And each of those, part of the reason of doing colour is that the files, sometimes even the paper, but certainly ink colour, pens, notebook colour, sits very well with that. I know what something is concerning. When I was first teaching at Keele, I was still working with the engineering, and I was also doing voluntary work in other capacities. So having these different colours and different notebooks, and I still do it. So I have a particular colour notebook for church, church stuff, which I write notes in the back. There's admin stuff to do with church. So from the outside, it doesn't look as kind of structured in some ways as it used to. But probably the thing with those notebooks, I love the idea of them, and they look really neat and tidy because I adore stationery anyway. But if I did try to use one of those in my life and separate my life, one of the sections would be filled up within a couple of weeks, and there probably wouldn't be anything much written in one of the other sections. So that to me would be kind of a waste.
That's really funny, because actually what I've listened to you talking in huge detail about how you would organise things and notebooks and what kind of notebook you need for this.
Thank you.
And you just need, that seems to me like an awful lot of brain power for something where, to my mind, you just want a notebook.
Yeah.
Like, I can have one notebook. My life is simpler.
But see, my response to that would be that because it's the way that my brain works, it isn't hard work.
No, and that's one of the things that I notice, that actually people with a preference for sensing are much happier with lots of things than I would be in all sorts of ways. I remember when we used to live across the road from one another, your house fascinated me because there was an awful lot of stuff in it, but you knew how to organise it. So, I mean, the fact that you didn't need cavity wall insulation, you had book insulation.
Yes.
But you had many, 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 many things. All of those things, you knew exactly where to lay your hands on them. So I remember at one point saying I could do with, you remember those photo corners that used to exist?
Yeah.
No, yeah, I've got a packet of those.
Do you want clear ones that are self-adhesive or ones that you lick? That's cool.
I have them, and they're in this place.
Yes.
So there's a sort of there's a level of order, and there's a level of ability to
my
deal
desk
with.
drawers have been long been admired in my workplaces. People are like, "Oh, go and look at Pauline's desk drawers." They've never seen anything like it because it's like they're so tidy.
Yeah. Whereas I feel quite overwhelmed by many stuffs, and I think partly because I don't think in terms of individual things. I think in terms of much bigger categories. One of the moments when I clearly felt God speak to me was when we were trying to sort out what is now my office upstairs, and it was just full of stuff. And I walked in and I couldn't see, well, there's this thing that could do with going there, and there's that thing that could do with going there, which I know my sensing friends would. So you've got all of yes. Yeah. Whereas I was just like, oh, my life, it's a big mess. And I clearly heard the Holy Spirit say to me very specifically, one thing at a time. And I'm like, that's not going to work. There are many, many, many things. But if you're saying one thing at a time, so I did just start to take one thing at a time. So I dealt with one thing at a time, which felt just that didn't make very much sense to me as an intuitive, because they're all different things. But actually, I discovered that once I had been doing one thing at a time for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, I'd made quite a lot of progress and got through it. So I get overwhelmed by many things. I think probably also there is also an introversion element to this, but I don't like sensory overload. But I'm not very good at managing lots of details. So I have sensing friends who remember their bank account numbers. You're nodding. Yeah, I've never got to the point of remembering my bank account number. And I don't remember in much detail either. So if I've watched a film, I probably won't remember particular scenes. I will come away with having enjoyed being part of the service. Yeah, or if there is
an element of story or something that you enjoyed or didn't enjoy, or
Yes, or if there is something in it that gives me an example of a particular principle or a particular idea, then I will remember that, and I will remember the scene connected with that. But I won't just randomly remember the stuff that happened in the film. To the extent that sometimes I don't even remember that I've watched something. And I remember years ago when you used to go to Blockbusters and get videos out. Had the really annoying experience of going all the way to Blockbusters and getting out a film that I had watched before and hated because I just didn't remember I didn't remember seeing it. It took a while. It took quite a while for me to get into it. Like, oh no, it's this one, and I've gone and got it again because the same thing that attracted me to it the previous time attracted me to it this time. Again.
Yeah.
So I think it's true to say that people with a preference for intuition are much more likely to have a focus which is towards the future, because you're looking at where could we go with this, what might happen next, rather than a preference for thinking about things that happened in the past, because the things that happened in the past is in some sense that boring, concrete, obvious stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is this sense that we're looking at what we have already seen and what we have already experienced.
Yeah.
But some of that, you bring it down to practical, and this is in some of the books that I've read, it's things like going on holiday. If somebody is sensing, for example, never surprise them with going away, for the weekend, because they will struggle with, what I haven't packed the right clothes, what you said about the colours and stuff like that. So it's like, I would deal very badly if you picked me up and took me somewhere and said, hey, look, we're going to do this, that and the other, I'd probably be quite uncomfortable, because I'd be like, but in order to enjoy this, I need blah, 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 which I don't have because I didn't know that this was what's going to happen. And it can make us seem kind of really staid. And if somebody is very spontaneous, they can think that, oh, you're such a plodder, you never do anything exciting. And it's like, well, because for me, and this I think is probably one of the ways in which it can be negative sometimes, this is what I was thinking about, is that because of that needing order and needing the details to be in place, I think sometimes I can find it quite hard to relax, because if something is not where it needs to be and it's kind of in my vision, I find it difficult to I'm fine in somebody else's house because I have that thing that, how somebody else has how somebody has their house is how they have their house. But in my own house, I know I find it quite difficult sometimes to relax, because I'm like, but there's that needs doing and that needs doing. And if I'm sitting here, all I'm seeing is there's this little mess in the corner over there. So I very much control my environment. So people will always know where my seat, where my chair is in my house, because there's always kind of things around it.
Going back to the going on holiday thing, I'm very happy to improvise. So I think that's one of the things that intuition can gift you with, is an ability to say, well, it doesn't matter if I haven't got the thing, I'll find another way of doing it. And I know that can be a sensing thing too, but there's the sort of, well, I'll find another way of doing it, or there'll be a different way that we can manage this. So I'm not that fussed if I haven't got the stuff. Whereas I would notice that when I've gone away places with people who are sensors, then they will often take more stuff with them than I do, because A, they can handle the more stuff, and B, they are much more likely to notice the sorts of things that we might want. Whereas I'm really not so fussed. I'm not so worried about things. I like thinking about things. I like experiencing things. I like being with people. I'm not that fussed about the stuff. There will be a small number of bits of stuff that I want, but I'm not nearly as bothered.
We have a phrase for this in our house. It's that I'm a bit of a Boy Scout, so it's that thing about being prepared for every eventuality. And
that's definitely a sensing thing.
Yeah, and also it's about, and some of it I kind of think, well, it's kind of around other people as well, because it's kind of like, well, I'm because sometimes I'll be thinking, well, okay, I'm happy with this, but I think because of the feeling as well, I'm always trying to anticipate other people's needs as well. So it's like, it isn't if I knew that the only person that I had to keep happy was me, I would probably, who knows, I might pack in a very different way. But it's very difficult to kind of turn off this thing, especially if somebody else is involved. It's very difficult to turn off this, right, okay, well, what do you think we might need? Like I say, the Boy Scout thing, do I really need my penknife? Do I really need something to take stones out of a horse's hoof?
You might.
Yes. You never know. You never know when it might come in.
Yeah.
I think my dad especially he's a real example of this, is that we used to literally, if we saw a screw or something in the street, we would pick it up and give it to my dad, and I think it really was the best present that we could give him. It's just unfortunate that now he has lots and lots of jars and tins filled with different types of screws and stuff, and it is that thing, you never know when it might come in useful. It's like,
but that 40,000 screws are not all going to come in useful.
Yes. And it is, again, it's one of those things that it can easily turn into, you become a hoarder, because, of course, anything, any particular size of box. And it's one of those things I'm having to really fight, is because I'm like, you cannot just keep acquiring stuff and keeping it because it might come in useful. It's
no, you can't.
Especially when it comes to, every single bit of packaging and every single bit of wrapping paper or, whatever. It's like, no. It can.
And over time, you'll end up with quite a lot of stuff.
Yes, especially if you don't move. Because I think moving, I know that I've got a lovely friend, and she's ended up moving a lot. And she used to say she would love being in my kitchen, because she would see all the different bits, and obviously they've all got a story to them and all this kind of stuff. And lots of the things that she might have, she doesn't have anymore, because she's moved 10, 15, 20 times. And every time you move, you automatically get rid of stuff. Gains and losses, aren't there, in everything? And I think with, however it is you're wired, I think the thing that matters, I would say, is that you understand that it's okay to be wired the way you're wired. And you've talked a lot about, I know when we're interacting with other people, and especially when you're interacting with people that are very differently wired to you, it's very easy to end up feeling, I don't fit here because I'm different to that person, or if I want to do my job better, I've got to become like them. And it's like, no, there's always a way of doing things to fit with who you are. And it's like, I would say it's way more important that you get confident in who you are and how you do things. Because if we try to do something that we see other people doing that doesn't come naturally to us, we will never do it as well as they do. So it's almost like we're always aspiring. You can end up aspiring for something that you're never going to get to, which is really, really, it's really bad.
Do a good job of being you. Don't do a bad job of being somebody else. Yeah.
You have two choices. You can stay there but be confident in who you are, or you leave and find somewhere, that fits you better, or that accepts you as you are, that you don't have to become something that you're not.
And I think the sensing intuition thing does run through so much of what we do. Right at the beginning, you were talking about the fact that it impacts the way that you interact with the world on a sensory level. And I absolutely see that. I remember there's been a few occasions when I have famously not noticed things which are significant. So there was once I got into work, and this chap, Clive, who was a colleague, he said, I waved to you whilst we were driving through Sneed Green and you didn't notice me. I said, Clive, I didn't notice Sneed Green. And indeed, I had been travelling this particular route every Wednesday for a number of years and never noticed that I went through a suburb called Sneed Green. So I did look out for Sneed Green the next time that I went, and noticed that indeed I did go through somewhere called Sneed Green.
Did you see him?
No, I didn't see him. I think I'd missed that.
No,
that was my one.
At that point.
No, that was my one opportunity, evidently. And then there was another occasion when I was out walking with friends, and they said, look at the deer. And I'm like, what deer? No, look at the deer. And I thought they meant a singular deer. So my concept of deer was sort of monarch of the
Christmas
glen,
card.
sort of a deer with horns. And then we got a bit closer and I realised the reason for the extent of their exasperation with me, because there was a whole herd of about 200. Yes, there was a mass of deer, but they didn't fit my concept. So I simply hadn't seen them. Yeah. And I often feel like my memory is absolutely dreadful because I talk to people who have a preference for sensing, who remember the details of stuff that they've seen or read or listened to. And I have come away with a number of theories which I can apply to all sorts of different things. But I have forgotten. I've just forgotten the details. And I think that is something which is just part of the way that I see the world. And so your kind of concrete seeing of things, it absolutely runs through who you are and the way that you approach things and your ability to deal with details. And I have to work hard to deal with details, and I can do it, but I need to know which details I'm looking for. And I'm quite likely to miss things, and everybody misses things sometimes. But your ability to kind of handle lots and lots of different bits and things and have a bag with lots and lots of stuff in it. My handbag, apart from kind of bits of tissues, painkillers and a journal and the book that I'm currently reading and some pens. And that's kind of it. I will not have
wet wipes.
No, I will not have.
It used to be quite a joke with some of my friends because I'm not somebody that's had children, but I would always have wet wipes in my handbag, and they'd be like, "But why when you don't have children?" I was like, "Well,
they're useful."
But yeah. So if somebody ever wanted one, I would be the place to go to. Needle and thread. In case buttons fallen off. I am the kind of person that those little sewing kits that they sell in the tourist shops, I'm the sort of person they're designed for. There's all these kinds of things, and sometimes I'm like I do kind of react to it. Sometimes I'm like I just want to get rid of it all, and this might be it might just be an age thing. Is that sometimes I'm just like I do wish sometimes that I could just turn off all of that stuff and not be in that position of being kind of motherboard all the time. It's like,
less of the things. I think you can probably make a pretty good guess as to whether somebody is if they're a sensor or an intuition person, depending on how neat are their nails and how much jewellery have they got. So,
what's your theory then?
My theory
do the
is,
sensors have more jewellery?
They're more like more. Yeah. So and you're not particularly a girly girl, but you still have more jewellery than me. I'm not a particularly girly girl either, but I have got one engagement ring.
Very new.
A new engagement ring. Yes, I have. But I have. But that is the extent of my jewellery. Whereas you needed to remove some bangles.
Yes.
And there are some other non-jangly bangles. So you've still got about 10 bangles.
Yeah.
And how many?
I guess they have memories because I kind of have. I mean, I have a gold arm and a silver arm.
Of course you do, because you are colour coordinated.
Yeah. But the main items, so the bangles, they are from India, so they're quite special. They're sort of special.
Yes, and now we're back into details because now I've mentioned bangles.
Yeah, and
you're going to tell me all of the things about the bangles, whereas as an intuitive,
and you're just like,
okay, I've done the bangle now. I just wanted to point out that you have bangles.
Take them off.
Right, but that's but my interest in the bangles in this point is I've got a point. I have a theory about senses and sensing intuition related to jewellery. So that is an example.
Seems to work.
It does seem to work.
Seems to work.
So the evidence works. So I've pointed that out. So I don't need to know where each of your bangles came from. Okay. Whereas you would be very
interested. Received and understood. I assumed that you had an interest in my bangles that you obviously don't.
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
But again, that's a thing that you could really wind people up with, and you could easily get quite wound up by somebody always giving you the detail of stuff.
Whereas in the course of this conversation, I've been kind of looking at, okay, so we're talking about this, so you'll go and talk about all of those different things, and I'll wait for it to come back.
Yeah, I think we've just a moment. This has been really well. It's always really helpful to talk because talking is how is a big part of kind of how I process things. I don't always talk in detail. It depends what you've asked me. I'm like, if you don't want me to talk in detail, ask me a closed question. It's like, it's easy, isn't it?
Do you think we've got to the end of this conversation now?
I don't know. What do you think?
I think
we probably have.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot more that we could say, but I think you've certainly made me think, because I guess historically I've thought that the extroversion and the feeling made a bigger difference, but I think in talking about this, I'm like, yeah, actually,
it's really key.
The sensing probably is the thing, and I guess it's probably the thing that potentially would cause arguments.
I think it definitely causes misunderstandings because you're thinking about and prioritising and seeing the world in different ways. Just to finish with, I remember at a Myers Briggs workshop, the first time that I encountered this stuff, having a conversation about the difference between people who do sensing and intuition. And my point being, well, I don't need to look at everything. I just need the relevant details. And then somebody saying, so how do you know which the relevant details are? And that really made me think, yes. Actually, it's really, really helpful to have other people who do spot more details than I do, because it's very easy to come up with a completely different logical argument if you start with different details.
Yeah.
And so having a healthy disregard for my grand theories and my kind of this is how the world works, I could pass that differently if I started with a different set of details.
But it is. I guess it's that thing. That's why we need each other, isn't it? It's like, because I would just be swamped with loads of detail if I didn't have a focus of where we're trying to get.
And sometimes you need somebody else to say, actually, we're heading this way.
Yes. And it's like, get out of that hole.
Yes, I know that one's interesting.
Yes. But actually, we don't have time for that hole now. I need you to go and look at that hole. And it's like, oh.
Yeah.
Other holes are available.
Yes. Yeah. This one's really interesting, but there's other big pictures too. Yeah. Fab. Thank you very much for that. That's great.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loved Called Gifted podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email lovedcalledgifted@gmail.com. You can find a transcript of this podcast at lovedcalledgifted.com. And that's also the place to go if you're interested in the Loved Called Gifted course, or if you'd like to find out about spiritual direction or coaching. Thank you for listening.